In 1999, South African anti-apartheid activist and revolutionary leader Nelson Mandela visited Gaza and said, "Our freedom is not complete without the freedom of the Palestinians." Now, since his death in 2013, Mandela's unifying message of decolonization reverberated across the globe. The anti-colonial, anti-apartheid struggle that Madiba led to end racial segregation and transform South Africa into a democratic nation has been lauded by Palestinians who have been drawing parallels between Israeli occupation and apartheid to the situation that Black South Africans faced at that time. Now, joining us to discuss the struggle against apartheid and the continued struggle against colonialism is Nkosi Zwelivelile Mandela, who since 2009 has been a member of the South African Parliament for the African National Congress Party. He's also the grandson of former president and anti-apartheid leader Nelson Mandela. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It is an honor to be on your invitation for this interview.
As we conduct this interview, Israel has launched a new invasion and bombing spree of Gaza this week, dubbed Operation Shield and Arrow. Currently, over 20 Palestinians have been killed, including several children, dozens injured, and homes demolished. Entire families have been killed in their sleep, children orphaned, people left homeless in the world's largest open-air prison. We are witnessing yet another massacre committed by the apartheid state, a state that was built off of the genocide of Palestinians, theft of their land, and with so much money, weapons, and support from the US and Great Britain, and even international community. So why has the world allowed this kind of oppression to continue 70 years on?
My grandfather, President Nelson Zwelivelile Mandela, coined it best when he said the Palestinian struggle is the greatest moral issue of our time, and yet the world remains silent. And I think as we came from that brutal past of 350 years of colonialism, coupled with 60 years of a brutal apartheid regime in South Africa, it is easy for us to relate with what is happening in occupied Palestine and the atrocities that are being meted out on a daily basis against Palestinians, and in particular, defenseless women and children. If you look to date, since the dawn of 2023, over 100 Palestinians have been killed, a quarter of which have been children under the age of 18. And yet you have many children's rights groups that advocate for children's rights, who remain silent on the issue and say nothing. Groups that champion women's rights are muted and say nothing when it comes to the brutality of Palestinian women. And for us, we can no longer be complicit. We can no longer be silent in the face of such brutality. And this is why we have picked up the baton where our founding father of our nascent democracy, President Mandela, left. And we are going to continue advocating for the Palestinian struggle. Right here in our own country in South Africa, we have been calling on our majority party, being the African National Congress, to cut off ties with apartheid Israel. We must cut off sport and trade ties with apartheid Israel. Things that we witness is where we say within the party, in the ANC, that we stand side by side with our Palestinian brothers. And yet at the same time, the Zionist apartheid regime, when they come into South Africa, they do not even have to present any visas. Yet our comrades and brothers in occupied Palestine, every time they have to come to South Africa, they are subjected to visas applications. And these are the double standards that we need to speak out against. And for me, it's about the small things that we can do as individuals, as a collective in our very own communities, that can go a long way into having a positive impact in support of the Palestinians. And I think we've repeatedly seen the support that is growing internationally in favor of the Palestinians. I mean, what we have been witnessing in London, in Canada, in the USA, with the growing and swelling numbers pouring out onto the streets and saying that we can no longer turn a blind eye in the face of such brutality. And I think we are beginning to be heard.
Now, you talk a lot about colonialism, which has now become such a, it's mentioned in vogue right now. So throughout the late 20th century, Africa went through a wave of formal decolonization where European powers were forced to grant independence to their former colonies. Yet many argue that Africa remains trapped in a colonial or neo-colonial relationship with the West. How does this play out, and what more must be done to achieve full independence across the African continent?
Well, for us, as I stated earlier, that we've had 350 years of colonialism, coupled with brutal regimes from European powers. That in the case of South Africa, we had 60 years of a brutal apartheid regime. Even though we celebrate our freedom today, we are only celebrating what we have been able to achieve and attain legislatively. But when it comes to economic freedom, we have scratched the surface in that regard. And I think it's going to take a number of years for us to be truly victorious and be able to speak out of a real freedom that we have attained. And when you then look at as to what we have been trying to do in solidifying our efforts, we have through the old OAU, which has culminated to becoming the African Union, have been able to bring about our member states to come together under one umbrella and to start focusing on programs that we can be able to champion together. We are also looking into a structure of bringing all the parliaments on the African continent under one umbrella through the Pan-African Parliament, where we can be able to thresh out the challenges that face us as Africans on the ground. And we are happy to witness that with the leadership of Chief Charumbira in the Pan-African Parliament, we have placed the Palestinian agenda high on as one of the number one priorities on our agenda. And therefore, it is in our right to ensure that we are able to enforce our sovereignty, and we are able to ensure that we develop ourselves as countries and as a continent. This is what we want to see for our own Palestinian brothers and sisters in occupied Palestine, that they should be able to see themselves realizing the freedom that we all cherish today. And they should be able to build a one state that will encompass all citizens living in occupied Palestine.
Could you detail the parallels between South Africa and Palestine and the apartheid that they both have faced?
Well, you can come to the understanding that both these apartheid state regimes were born in 1948. In the case of South Africa, when the National Party won the election in 1948, that is when apartheid came to be. And also in 1948, through the catastrophe being the Nakba, it gave birth to the Zionist apartheid state of Israel. And in so doing, like a true apartheid state, they then came with unjust laws to restrict movement of the indigenous people of the land. In the case of South Africa, there were many segregational policies and law movement. So one would be through the Group Areas Act, South Africans, 13% of South Africans with, 87% of the population was forced into 13% of the land, whereas white supremacists that had 10% of the population enjoyed 87% of the land. This was achieved through wars of dispossession, where Africans were removed of the land of their birth and the land of their forefathers. We were forcefully removed and placed into homeland reserves and into Bantustans that we rejected. If you look at what has been happening right throughout the years since 1948, 3.5 million Palestinians were forcefully removed out of their villages, and many fled into the diaspora and are living right throughout the global community in refugee camps. That has led to illegal settlements coming on the rise. On the daily basis in Silwan, in South Hebron, in Jerusalem, we witnessed the eviction of Palestinians, which is against international law. And these are the similarities that we see. But also, in my travel in occupied Palestine in 2017, when I drove from Jericho to Ramallah to Bethlehem, Jerusalem, as well as Hebron, I witnessed the many checkpoints that were in place, the dignity that was stripped away of elders in particular by young IDF soldiers, some of them coming from our very own beloved country, South Africa, coming to serve in the IDF. And these are the people that we are flagging in South Africa and be saying that our government should embark on a witch hunt, because no South African citizen is permitted to pick up arms in another country. And you see that Palestinians are subjected to the biggest open-air prison when you speak of Gaza. And 2 million Palestinians are locked down there, denied any form of freedom of movement. This is what we came to be experiencing in South Africa through the Bantustans in Transkei, in Venda, in Bophuthatswana, as well as in the Ciskei. When you speak of Gaza, it personally reminds me of a Bantustan I lived in the former Transkei. And these are the similarities that we are quick to see. And every South African leader that has been to occupied Palestine can only draw one conclusion once we return, that what the Palestinians are experiencing is a worse form of apartheid than we ever experienced as South Africans.
Absolutely. It's a traumatic event when anybody who has never been to Palestine visits Palestine. We appreciate that you made that visit and were able to document the crimes that Israel is committing. There were those that condemned the ANC and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa for violently resisting their occupiers and their oppression. Indeed, your grandfather was on the US government's terrorist list just until 2008 because of his refusal to renounce and denounce that violence. Do you think that there are parallels, to this in Palestine today? As Palestinians resist occupation and Gaza resists?
Absolutely. President Nelson Mandela was the first volunteer in chief in the Defiance campaign, which fought against the unjust laws of the apartheid regime. And he was the first one to call the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe, which was the ANC's armed wing. And in this, he said and put a convincing argument that we can no longer tolerate the oppression and brutality from the apartheid regime. And therefore, we have resolved to take up arms in defense of our people's dignity. And Palestinians have a similar right to defend the dignity of their people. You know, in 1976, when the youth of Soweto took up into the streets to have more militant protests and to be out, that was a turning point in our history that inspired many right throughout our country to pour out and defy the apartheid regime. And this is why we say that in the Palestinian struggle, whether be it is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or it is Hamas, if they so choose the path to pick up arms in defense of their people, apartheid Israel can no longer be left unchecked. We call on all Palestinians and civil society and civil rights activists to come together under the umbrella of BDS, and also all political parties must be able to set aside their political differences and unite Palestinians under one umbrella of being the oppressed people of Palestine. It was only then we as South Africa, when we set aside our differences and united under one umbrella being the United Democratic Front in the 80s, that we were able to enjoy the vast majority of support of our people. And we believe that Palestinians can also do likewise to mobilize all their people and have one common campaign in ensuring that we have effective protests and we are able to expose the apartheid regime of Israel as such. We are happy today that institutions like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have defined the Zionist state of Israel as an apartheid state.
Yeah, it's definitely a move in the right direction. And now we are seeing more African states talk about holding Israel accountable, including what you described that's happening in South Africa. The African Union asked its member states to cut all scientific, cultural, and even some economic ties with Israel until it reverses its colonial practices against Palestine. What do you think Africa can do even more to lead the world again in opposing apartheid?
Because we come from that past, we understand the scars and the brutality of the past. We have been on the platform to say that as long as there is one single human being suffering in the world, we will be there to speak out on their behalf. And in this regard, we as the AU and in the African continent have been able to reject the observer status that apartheid Israel was given. And you would have seen South Africa, Kenya, and Algeria lead that campaign to ensure that apartheid Israel's observer status was revoked. And we applaud the African states and the AU for having done that. But a lot of work still needs to be done. We still need to get all member states to ensure that they totally advocate for the Palestinian struggle. We have a belief that if the Arab dagger has gone on the back of our Palestinian brothers and sisters, Africa will rise. Africa will liberate Palestine. And this is why we stand in solidarity with our comrades and brothers in occupied Palestine.
Now, Palestine, however, and this is my last question for you, is not the only colonized land remaining. Earlier this year, you spoke out against the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara. Now, it's not a subject that receives much attention in the West, although we do cover it at MIT Press. What is going on there, and why do you describe it as Africa's last colony?
You know, for me personally, Palestine sits right at the center of my heart. But on my right hand, I always carry Western Sahara everywhere I go, and that's my bracelet of the Western Sahara, which I was given by His Excellency President Ghali. We must state it that the colonizer in Western Sahara was Spain. It exited in 1975. And immediately, the Moroccan government seized the opportunity to invade Western Sahara. And since then, Western Sahara has been living under occupation by a member state of the AU, being Morocco. And we as South Africa know our relationship that we have had with our comrades in Polisario and in Western Sahara, that they stood side by side with us during our struggle for liberation. I know also, having visited the refugee camps in Tindouf, we saw tanks that were apprehended by Polisario in a sanction-busting attempt by Morocco, who had procured these tanks on behalf of apartheid Israel, and they were coming through Morocco. But our comrades and brothers in Polisario were able to apprehend these tanks. So our relationship with Polisario and the Sahrawi people runs deep, and we continue, therefore, to speak against the occupation. And we regard the Western Sahara to be the last colony of Africa. And this is why, if we are ever serious as Africans in decolonizing Africa, we will leave no stone unturned in ensuring that we realize a free, decolonized Africa in our lifetime by liberating Western Sahara.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you joining me today for this interview and this very fruitful conversation. And, you know, as a Palestinian, I salute you for all the support that you have given us as Palestinians and for your continued fight against apartheid.
Thank you, my respected sister. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.